The other thread in my life which has been important and which has impacted on how strongly I feel about the death penalty is that I've been involved very strongly in cases of miscarriages of justice. In the Australian context, I was involved in the Lindy Chamberlain case, and Malcolm Brown, a Sydney Morning Herald reporter, and I wrote a lot about the Lindy Chamberlain case, and I went and talked about the Lindy Chamberlain case. And even though we didn't have the death penalty in operation, I always thought to myself, if the death penalty had been in operation, a terrible mistake could have been made. Even if Lindy Chamberlain and her husband were guilty, it would have been an atrocious punishment if it had been implemented. And the point about miscarriages of justice is that even though I point to them and say there has been a miscarriage, I still maintain that even if the person had been guilty, then the death penalty is a draconian step, a step which violates every possible human rights and which does not serve society well. I find it very hard to see how in so-called Christian nations like the United States and like Australia, so-called Christians so many so-called Christians can so strongly play God. But that is, of course, another issue, and one which Frank is far better fitted than I am to talk about. But in terms of Lindy Chamberlain, then came a whole lot of cases that I was involved in. The case of Kelvin Condren, the Aboriginal man here in Queensland, who was convicted of murdering his girlfriend in a very brutal way, and he was convicted and thrown into jail until they found out that at the time of the crime, when he allegedly committed the crime, he was locked up in a police lockup, and he couldn't have committed the crime. The case of Graham Stafford, which we're currently working on now, who killed Leanne. I can go through case after case after case that I've been involved with where miscarriages of justice would have occurred if the death penalty had been in operation. And let me come to the third thread, I think, to my strong and total opposition to the death penalty, which is my involvement in Asia. For a number of years I've worked in Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, and to a lesser extent in Singapore. And I've seen in those countries, all of which at one stage had the death penalty, the Philippines doesn't have it now, I've seen what I think were fairly atrocious miscarriages of justice occur, and the last one that I saw was in the Philippines, where at least two cases that I'm aware of, the people were clearly innocent of the crime, but let me repeat again, even if they weren't, the death penalty was clearly inappropriate. What I've also seen on the personal level was the case of Schapelle Corby, where I gave evidence for the defence. And I know that I spent only a short time with Schapelle Corby, but in looking into her eyes and seeing at that stage the pain of what she may face, and she did face the death penalty, I could see, I think on a personal level, how much a person who has been condemned to death can suffer, and I think Scott Rush's parents put that very, very well today. But if I can, on a more academic level, I also know that in Asian countries, whether it be in Singapore, in Thailand, or in Indonesia, or in the Philippines, the death penalty has not deterred drug trafficking or murder or any other major crime. It simply has not. And at one stage when I worked for the Institute of Criminology, I got into a fairly acrimonious debate with some in Singapore about how effective the death penalty had been in Singapore. And I could find no evidence that they could produce which showed that it had been effective in actually having any effect on the drug peddling rate or any other crime. And the same, I would argue, goes for Indonesia, for the Philippines as well, and also I should add for Thailand. So what I'm saying very, very clearly tonight is that the imposition of the death penalty does not do anything to solve drugs or any other crime in those Asian countries. What it does, unfortunately, is deter society and politicians away from policies and procedures which might do something about drug trafficking, which might do something about reducing crime in those countries, or for that matter, I would argue in other countries where capital punishment is in process, like, for example, the United States. Let me perhaps bring this all together, because I think it's important that we get you as an audience involved, by saying that I am appalled that the Australian government hasn't taken a stronger stance against the imposition of the death penalty in the cases involving the Oz 9. I'm appalled that the Australian government hasn't spoken out more strongly about the death penalty in any country against anyone, whether it be an Australian or an Indonesian or a Thai or a Filipino or somebody from Singapore, being against every convention of human rights that we know, and specifically against the 1948 UN Declaration on Human Rights. I'm appalled, as Frank Brennan has indicated, that the federal police got so involved in such a proactive way in the Oz 9 case, and I think that what we have to do is to say, as a society, we cannot uphold what we call our moral principles without speaking out. What do we do about all this? Well, I think there's no easy answer. There's no magic bullet. I think it's important, no matter how few people come, to have meetings like this. I think it's important to confront politicians of all persuasions who support the death penalty or don't actually speak out against the death penalty, and specifically in the case of the Oz 9, don't say anything about it whatsoever. I think we have to speak out against it, and we have to speak out against it very, very strongly. That does not mean that we criticise Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines as a society, but we do say, as they say to us quite correctly, at times, your policy on this is wrong, and you cannot execute, whether it be Australians or your own people. It's against every basic human right. Thank you very much indeed for coming, and we look forward to your questions.